Hi, I'm Mark from eReplacementParts.com. In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the bearings in a Porter Cable 690 router. When you consider that your 690 router spins at 23,000 RPM, it's amazing that the bearings last as long as they do. But eventually they will fail and will need to be replaced. Signs that the bearings have gone bad will be unusual sounds, such as a ticking sound or the bearings starting to squeal. You may also notice some excessive heat around the bearing locations on the motor castings. Another sign that your bearings are going bad is that when you rotate the router spindle by hand, there's a lot of resistance. It doesn't rotate freely. If this is the case, you'll need to replace the bearings. Replacing them is easy to do, and I'm going to show you how. Router bearings, as well as many other parts, can be found on our website. Let's get started. I'll begin by removing the router motor from the router's base. And now I'll go ahead and remove the two screws that secure the cap to the motor. Now I'll remove the brushes so that they don't get hung up on the bearing as we remove the top half of the motor housing. Now I'll make a reference mark between the upper and lower motor housings. This will just make it easier to line everything up when we go to put it back together. Now I can remove the two screws that secure the upper half of the motor housing to the lower half. And a few taps with a rubber mallet will help me to separate these two pieces. Next, we need to remove what's called the chuck from the armature shaft. If you haven't already, you'll want to remove the collet from the chuck. Then I'll grab the exposed portion of the armature with a rag, just to protect my hands, and I'll use an impact wrench with an 1 1/8" socket to remove the chuck. Now I need to remove the armature from the bearing within the lower motor housing. The best way to do this is to use a bearing press if you have one. If you don't, you can use a rubber mallet. Make sure you use a rubber mallet and not a metal hammer, as striking the end of the armature with a metal hammer will damage these threads. The bearing is held in the motor housing with a retaining ring. I'll use a pair of retaining ring pliers to remove it. I've selected a socket that has the same diameter as the inner race on the bearing. I'll place the socket on top of that inner race and then use my mallet to tap the bearing out of the motor housing. Now I can install the new bearing. I'll slide it into the motor housing and then use a socket the same diameter as the outer race, or just slightly smaller, and I'll tap it in with a mallet. And now I'll reinstall the retaining ring. Now I can install the armature back into the lower motor housing. I'll line up the shaft with the lower bearing, and again use a rubber mallet to tap it back into place. I'll use a bearing puller to remove the upper bearing. I'll line up the center post of the puller on the dimple on the end of the armature shaft, and then go ahead and pull the bearing. Now we can install the new bearing. I'm going to apply just a very small amount of grease to the end of the armature shaft. This will make installing the new bearing a little bit easier. Place the bearing onto the shaft, and using a socket the same diameter as the inner race on the bearing, I'll tap it into place. Now I'll reinstall the chuck. I'll thread it onto the spindle, and again I'm holding the armature with a rag, and I'll secure it with the impact. Now I can reinstall the lower half of the motor housing to the upper half. I'll insert the armature through the field, make sure that it lines up properly with the top half of the housing, and line up our reference marks that we made earlier. Just like that. And I'll secure the upper and lower halves of the motor housing with the screws. Now I can reinstall the cover. I just want to make sure I have all the wires tucked in and make sure that nothing's going to get pinched, especially in this area, when I put the cover back on. Now I can reinstall the brushes. The brush just slides into the brush holder. Then I line up these tabs on the end of the brush wire with the slots in the brush holder. Hold that in place and slide one of the caps on. This part can be a little tricky. It might take a couple of tries to get all that lined up. Then I'll secure the brush with a screwdriver. You want to be careful not to over tighten these or you will crack them. And I do that same thing on the other side. And I'll finish up by reinstalling the base. And now you know how to replace the bearings on your Porter Cable 690 series router. If you found this video helpful, be sure to give us a thumbs up and leave a comment.